Welcome to the Very Good Sports Podcast. We are joined today as we preview the Green Bay Packers offseason. We are joined by my good amigo, Nick at draft_Packers. Nick, how are you doing today, my friend?
Man, I'm doing pretty well. I got this little podcast to get through, and then introduce my ass to the couch, and go ahead and watch some House of Cards.
Yes, that new release of the House of Cards, and I'm looking forward to the episode involving the dress and their political debate about black and blue versus green or versus white and gold.
Still blue and gray, or blue and gold, but that's okay.
On today's show, we are going to be previewing the Packers offseason, talking about numerous coaching changes they made, some unexpected, some expected. We're going to examine their cap situation, which actually they did us a favor and made the cuts early, so they're no longer hypothetical cuts. Going to look at their free agency and their draft needs. And we start out right out with coaching changes. Obviously, everyone expected, even before the NFC Championship game, Sean Slocum was going to be out the door. He was going to be fired. And Mike McCarthy, being the loyal coach he is, always being there for his friends, said, "Hey there, Ron Zook. You're the man for the job. You're going to be our new special teams coach." Nick, what do you think about the hire?
Um, I don't really have a whole lot positive to say about it. Hiring within didn't seem like the best option, particularly Ron Zook, who's just never been a good football coach. You go back to his college days when he was hired at Florida and Illinois, I think. And both teams just shit the bed. And the only reason he was ever hired to be those coaches is because he was a fantastic recruiter. And oddly enough, in the NFL, you can't do that. But I don't see how this is an improvement really at all. It just doesn't make any sense. But when it comes to special teams, I don't really know. So, at this point, I hope it works out, but it just doesn't seem to be the greatest of ideas. Really, though, like, as long as Mason Crosby, we have two of the best specialists in the league, punter and kicker. Really, it's going to come down to is just getting those veterans out there and hoping that they can make a tackle or two.
You know, Nick, from listening to this, I get the sense that you're not excited about Zook's renowned energy he brings to the locker room and working with his players. But I will say I tend to agree about the Ron Zook thing, obviously. NFL rules still don't allow you to recruit, which is odd. I keep hoping they'll change that. But the only change that maybe you could see is Mike McCarthy, which we're about to get into, gave up his play calling duties to be more part of the just everything going along the sidelines, which means he will be in the special teams room working with those guys. He promised changes are coming, so hopefully we see changes made.
Change we can believe in.
And now we mentioned McCarthy. He gave up his play calling duties, gave them to Tom Clements. Obviously, the focus for McCarthy. People point to after the NFC Championship game, reporters asked him about Clay Matthews' injury. He had no idea Matthews came out of the game, and I think McCarthy, that became an issue for him, not knowing what's going on with his players injury-wise, and then being able to divvy up and be involved on defense in special teams, that will be a big thing for him. Looking toward Tom Clements as the play caller, he lost his offense coordinator job but was promoted to play caller. Do you think we could see any changes in a play calling under Tom Clements?
I don't think we specifically know as to if his philosophies are significantly different from McCarthy, but something tells me he's not going to be like as forgiving as McCarthy or his buddy with everyone. I don't see John Kuhn being a part of the offense anymore, thankfully. Third and one dives with the fullback, this is 2015. That doesn't work anymore. The NFL is changing. There's no point in getting some 260-pound white guy who's unathletic and can't move. There's no point in getting him the ball when you have guys like Cobb, Nelson, Adams, those type of guys moving forward. So I don't think he's going to be looking to get, a guy like Kuhn's not going to have a role with the Packers anymore. I don't think they're going to re-sign him. But I mean, other than that, I don't think there's anything significant that would suggest that um, that we're going to know this if there's going to be any significant changing in the play calling other than maybe a guy like Kuhn's role in the offense.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think, pretty much the same. If we can see the halfback tosses to Eddie Lacy, which their success rate wasn't very good, but McCarthy kept running with them, or John Kuhn just handed them to him on 3rd and 1 when you have Eddie Lacy, who is a powerful back, but you decide, I want to yell, Kuhn! So those things, hopefully, we can see change. Obviously, there was also the NFC Championship game decisions to not go for it inside the 5 and take the field goal. That remains to be seen under Tom Clements. Maybe it changes. Maybe they share that philosophy of playing it safe.
Yeah, I mean, going forward with Clements, he's been, I think, the offense coordinator, or like at least partial offense coordinator, ever since McCarthy came in with the Packers. So I feel like at this point that they're going to have a similar philosophy as in terms of play calling and offense and such. But there's going to be some subtle changes that we'll see pretty quickly, I think. But going forward, I'm not even sure. Like if Tom Clements has one good year even as the offense coordinator, that he wouldn't have other offers outside of the Packers as a head coach even next year. I mean, he's been with the Packers, McCarthy, Rodgers, since 2005, I think. So I mean, at that point, he's shown that he has the coaching resume and whatnot, and if he can put up similar numbers to McCarthy, what he's done, or even bigger, he's going to have opportunities to be a head coach in the league.
Absolutely. You mentioned Clements has been with McCarthy ever since they arrived in Green Bay in 2006. He has spent the past few years offense coordinator. Before that, he was quarterback coach from 2006 to 2011. And now I think you hit it right on that this could be the final step for him in terms of climbing up the ladder. If he can, he's been an offense coordinator, he's been a quarterback's coach. If he can show success as a play caller in Green Bay, even with all the talent, I think he could be one of the names that emerges for a head coaching job next year, which opens up the door for 2 other candidates for his eventual replacement. Green Bay has out quarterbacks coach Alex Van Pelt, who Rodgers was a big fan of, has praised him multiple times. And Van Pelt was the St. Louis Rams requested to interview him for the offensive coordinator position. Green Bay denied that request. So then they chose to pass up on Van Pelt for the OC job, but they handed him the quarterback wide receiver role. So going forward, I mean, if Clements leaves, Alex Van Pelt could be that guy that emerges as a play caller. Or we could see Edgar Bennett, who is wide receivers coach, running backs coach, and was just named offense coordinator, potentially emerge in 2016 or later.
Yeah, I mean, both I think are highly thought of around the league in and of itself. I mean, like you said, Van Pelt was looked at as a possible offense coordinator in St. Louis. And Edgar Bennett, he started off, I believe, as the wide receiver coach of the Packers a few years back, and just improvements from guys like Jordy and Cobb, and I mean, even the steady improvement of Devontae Adams this past year. He's shown that he can get the job done there, and I mean, at that point, you have to give him some more responsibility. But I think both guys are thought of highly around the league, and if a guy like Clements moves on to a head coaching spot, one of the two will probably get the future play calling, offensive coordinator duties, and the other maybe looking at that type of job somewhere else around the league.
Absolutely. And Green Bay also made smaller changes. They hired away Mike Solari, 49ers offensive line coach, who will be an assistant for the offensive line in Green Bay. Solari, pretty good offensive line coach. The 49ers have obviously had a lot of success with Mike Iupati and Joe Staley and all the guys there. Also, you would have seen him during the NFL Scouting Combine. He was working a lot with the offensive line prospects. They also hired away Sooners defensive line coach Jerry Montgomery, who I was talking to Bleacher Report's Kurt Pobjay, who obviously follows Oklahoma closely, and Montgomery is heavily respected. Bob Stoops in Oklahoma tried to keep him. They gave him the co-defense coordinator position about a month before Packers hired him away as a defensive assistant or the right-hand man to Dom Capers. And one interesting connection about this is Green Bay needs a nose tackle. They brought on Jerry Montgomery. And one of Jerry Montgomery's little players at Oklahoma was a big defensive or a big nose tackle, Jordan Phillips, who could be an option for Green Bay at 30. Do you think that was a possible connection with the hire?
I think potentially. I think a lot of people are thinking that Jordan Phillips would be proper value late in the first round, or even if they're somehow able to trade back into the early portion of the second round, that Phillips would be a good guy to go ahead and immediately be able to fill that nose tackle position in base defense, and eventually at some point be allowed, you can play him on third downs, rush the passer, Jesus. But I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see if there's, if you're going, because it came down to, I think, it came down to a guy like Montgomery, and I know they also had the Badgers defensive coordinator Dave Aranda in for that position, just for interviews and whatnot. I think that it ended up going down to, if you're going to choose Montgomery, it's because in this draft, I mean, you have guys, multiple defensive players from Oklahoma who, are going to be drafted, and especially a guy like Phillips, who's, potentially going to be available at 30. He might be even available a little bit later, particularly after a somewhat poor combine. But I mean, it certainly can't hurt their chances of taking a guy like Phillips.
Definitely. There's just a lot of changes that McCarthy made. Some mentioned unexpected. Nobody really saw him giving up play calling, but he did. Solari hire as assistant offensive line coach, bringing on Jerry Montgomery. I think we can agree were very good hires. Moving forward to the Packers cap situation, obviously we've talked about this in the past. Thought it was pretty much a guarantee. A.J. Hawk and Brad Jones were cut. Quickly on those guys, A.J. Hawk, some have called him a bust because of his fifth overall pick, but really he had a nice 9-year career with Green Bay. He was a great teammate. He also, when Green Bay needed him to take a cut in pay, he was willing to do that. And one other cut Green Bay made, which I have to go on a little rant about, is Brandon Bostic. It only cut a little bit amount of money, but there's been so much focus about Green Bay cutting him because of that one onside kick in the NFC Championship game. I'm just going to say that's crap. The reason Brandon Bostic was cut, I wish him the best in Minnesota. He has potential. But if you go back to reports through the season, he wasn't picking up the offense. This was his third year with the team. He was having issues staying healthy. And after 3 years, Green Bay decided, you know what, after that play, all right, that was the final straw. We're just going to move on. We're going to draft a young tight end who we can develop and start new with.
Yeah, I mean, that situation, is fairly similar to, Slocum getting fired as a special teams coach. I mean, he's been underachieving for, a few years now, and you're expecting him to finally put something together. And basically, one final play, which, I can't say it necessarily cost the season, because it should never have come down to that point. But that final, it was, that last straw, that broke the camel's back. It's just done. But going back to A.J. Hawk, you're talking about him. It saved roughly, I think, $3 to $3.5 million by cutting him. He ended up as the Packers' all-time leading tackler. Like you said, if he was a third-round pick, you'd be talking about how he was such a good player for the Packers a long time. He was never a great player. What you expect from a number 5 overall pick, but he was a low-end starter at linebacker. I always made the joke that no one made tackles 4 yards downfield better than A.J. Hawk. He's just not a player you're going to go on ahead and attack downhill at a high rate. But he was a functional starter for a long time. But at this point, you couldn't really justify paying him $3 to $3.5 million a year as a part. A player was going to only play 50% of downs, and he was never a special teamer. So at that point, you just couldn't really justify paying him that kind of money to play. Probably a low-end starter and only a certain amount of snaps. But now you're looking at close to 33 million, somewhere around that range in cap space, especially after cutting Brad Jones, who isn't an NFL football player. He's god awful. I don't mean to rag on the guy. He's supposed to be one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, but he's terrible. So I mean, at that point, what you're looking at is just, I mean, a 30 to 35 million going forward that allows you to have some kind of room to look at your guys who are free agents like Cobb, Balaga, and House, Tremont. I mean, that moving forward. But I mean, the Packers certainly have enough money to wheel and deal in free agency.
Absolutely, you mentioned the amount of money Green Bay has. They have about 32 million cap space. They could have had more if they decided to cut or restructure Julius Peppers' contract, who's going to count 12 million against the cap this year. But Pro Football Talk reported that it's very unlikely Green Bay makes any movement or subtractions with the salary this year, so he will likely remain at 12 million. So you're sitting at 32 million cap space, which is a solid, very good amount. But you have several notable free agents. You have Devon House, Tremont Williams, Brian Bulaga, LaTroy Guillaume, and Randall Cobb. How much of these current guys do you think you'll be able to keep at $32 million?
I mean, I don't see a problem with. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, Cobb I think is looking at roughly $9 million a year. Bulaga is probably going to end up being close to that. I mean, when he's healthy, I mean that's the big if and when. He's one of the best right tackles in the NFL, but how many games is he going to play a year for you? Maybe 10. You've never really gotten more than 12 to 14 in a year out of him. So he's still going to be able in that $7 to $8 million range. Another guy that people are going to be surprised to hear this, but House is going to be a guy who's going to get paid. I mean, if he makes it to free agency, you see he's got all the physical tools to be a very good corner in this league. I mean, he's probably best suited as a number 2. But I mean, with his size, 6'1", about 200 pounds, and he moves well. He ran in the 4.4s. He's got plenty of length. But he's a guy that people are going to be surprised to hear. But he's going to be looking at a 4 to 5 year deal in that $5 million a year range. And that might sound like a lot, but that's the going rate for a number 2 corner with the type of upside that he has. Being that he's still a young guy and that kind of size that NFL teams are beginning to covet. A guy like Guillaume. He's probably not going to be with the Packers next year. I don't see any way that his situation for a guy who, I mean, he's never really been a quality NFL player before this past season. I mean, he was a Viking for a long time, or not a long time, but he was with the Vikings for a while before the Packers signed him. I mean, going back to that, sloppy seconds that those teams like to pass around. But I mean, I don't see inside the franchise or inside our own free agents, there seems to be plenty of money to go around for those top 5 or 6 guys.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with Devon House, we're seeing in the NFL draft chat, there's a lot of talk about Trey Wayne's size, Eric Rowe's size, and that's the thing Devon House has. NFL teams love the length at corner. They love the athleticism and size. You can check all those boxes on Devon House. He has the NFL experience. He's shown he can't go up against guys on occasion like Des Bryant because of his size. So really, 5 years, $5 million for House makes a lot of sense. Only question is if Green Bay is the team that gives it to him when he hits the open market.
Yeah, I mean, in the past they've shown that they've been willing to give their guys, inside of the franchise. I mean, you go back to paying Jordy. They don't let a lot of guys who are young on the team and who have shown some success to even reach free agency, let alone, not resign them. I mean, you can look at a guy like Sam Shields. They end up, ponying up 4 years, $39 million for him. So basically, I think that he's a guy that they're going to prefer to bring back. Particularly, I mean, you have another guy like Tremont Williams. I mean, who at this point they're probably equal level players. They're both very good players in this league, but Tremont Williams being 32 years old, what kind of contract can you dole out to a guy like that and expect a fair return on value? And given that he's 32, you can't be giving him more than a year or 2 deal at $4 or $5 million a year plus. But I still could see another team who values that type of veteran leadership, that number 2 corner ability, to go ahead and give him that 2 years to $10 million range. And I mean, at this point, Ted Thompson has shown he's willing to let veterans, when they're getting to that age. I mean, to walk. I mean, at that point, you're much more susceptible to injury and whatnot. And I mean, eventually, age catches up to you in terms of physical ability as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you said we've seen it with Ted Thompson. Guys over their 30s on both sides of the ball. I mean, there was Scott Wills, there was Colin Jenkins, who I mean, he played very well for Green Bay inside, but he got into that 30 range, and Ted Thompson was ready to say, you know what, best of luck to you. He finds the young players that he likes and he keeps them. And it makes me think about looking forward with this cap situation about next year's free agents. You have guys like Mike Daniels and Casey Hayward, key pieces of this defense who are young, who, while you have to sign some of these guys in your own 2015 free agency, you also have to look towards 2016 and the guys you'll have to keep.
Yeah, I mean, between Casey Hayward and Mike Daniels, they're probably two of the 4 or 5 best players on our defense alone. I mean, Mike Daniels is a rising star in the NFL. He's one of the best 3 techniques in the league. And it's finally, if for the longest time you could have called him the most underrated defender in the NFL, but it seems now that people are finally catching up to that. But it's going to be interesting. I mean, like you said, roughly $32 million right now in free agency space. Next year, I'm not too versed in players that can be cut, whatnot. Clay Matthews, cough. But like if going forward, you're going to have to pay these guys. Mike Daniels is going to cost $8-9 million a year easily. Casey Hayward, he struggles with injuries. He's kind of limited to playing the slot. So I'm not sure what kind of money he'll be looking at, but I'm sure it'll be somewhere in that $5 million a year range. When he's healthy, he's one of the best slot corners in the league, and it's not really close. So I mean, going forward, you're gonna have to choose between a guy like I hate saying this, but like, are you gonna sign Randall Cobb this year at $9 million, or are you gonna sign Mike Daniels next year at $9 million? And when it comes to values specifically positional, I'm gonna have to lean Mike Daniels. And people hate saying or hearing this, and you'll see all over Packers Twitter is pay Cobb. He's a great player. He is, but as a guy who is limited to the slot, he's not one of the 15 best wide receivers in the NFL. People don't want to hear that, but I mean, it is what it is. But you're not going to be able to pay 2 receivers $10 million a year, especially if you want to be able to retain other players who have some value, especially players on the defensive line. Like Mike Daniels, who's, like I said, is turning into one of the better 3 techniques in the NFL. So it's going to be interesting. I know Ted Thompson is the cap god. You won't see a guy better at it maneuvering around the cap, setting up contracts so that players, 2 to 3 years in, have all their guaranteed money gone, so that players, so that they can go ahead and if they're not playing up to their value, he can go ahead and get rid of them. I mean, you can even look at a contract, like I said, Clay Matthews next year, I believe, is roughly scheduled to make 13 or 14 million, but only like 3 of that's guaranteed. So people aren't going to want to hear this because they love him, he's handsome, whatnot. You can say whatever you want. It's going to come down to, is he a $14 million a year player anymore? No, he's just not. So I mean, you're going to have to choose. Is it you just can't sign all of these guys. So people have their favorites, and they're going to be a little, like people love Clay, people love Randall Cobb, but you just can't pay all of them.
Absolutely. I think basically you nailed it with position value. And I mean, Ted Thompson, cap god, he is also the god of finding wide receivers. Randall Cobb, Jordy Nelson, Devontae Adams. I mean, you could even say Jarrett Boykin. He was an undrafted late-round pick. But still, there was some talent there, and he was productive in 2013. You also had Charles Johnson, who Green Bay had, who's now shining with Minnesota. And basically with Johnson, there was an undiagnosed torn ACL. Cleveland Browns were able to claim and put him on injured reserve, so that's how Green Bay lost him. But that's another guy that Ted Thompson found. So really, you have to have full faith in Ted Thompson finding a wide receiver at some point. It could even be a guy like Jeff Janis from last year's draft, who Mike McCarthy praised at the Combine as still being very high on. And I think, so basically we are down to the Randall Cobb decision. I think you said it perfectly about $9 million for Mike Daniels versus $9 million or more for Randall Cobb. And you take Mike Daniels. And $9 million is a figure that ESPN's Rob Demovsky reported a few weeks ago that Cobb is seeking. Although Cobb did tweet the other day, you can't believe everything you hear from the media. Looking at that $9 million, because free agency opens up on March 10th, and it's possible Cobb can get that or even more. At what point do you, if you're Ted Thompson, do you say, you know what, I'm out, Randall, I wish you the best of luck?
Probably if he makes it to free agency. You look at teams, especially Oakland, who are facing $60 to $70 million in cap space and a severe need as to a guy who can always get open, who's a very good receiver for a guy like a young quarterback with a lot of potential like Derek Carr. Teams like Carolina also have have a need for receiver and some space. Jacksonville could use that veteran leadership at receiver. They have some young guys who could eventually get pretty good. But if he hits the open market, I could easily see them hitting, that $11 to $12 million a year range, 5-year contract, somewhere in that range. And at that point, you just got to let him go. I mean, you can't be paying a slot receiver that kind of money in the NFL. If you're talking 5 years in that $60 million a year range, you just can't pay him that kind of money. It's pretty simple in that regard. I mean, if he makes it to free agency, he's going to get a significant amount of money more than the Packers are willing to offer.
Absolutely. No, I mean, really, I went back and forth on this earlier in the year, but really coming down to it, I do think Randall Cobb leaves. I mean, we all love Randall Cobb. But when it comes down to the money, listen, I want Randall Cobb to get every dollar possible. Every NFL player in the NFL deserves the opportunity to maximize your net worth and set your family up for the best you can. So Randall Cobb, if he can get $10 million, if he can get $11 million per year, go for every dollar possible. I just don't think it's going to be in Green Bay.
Yeah, like I said, I think they're going to be willing to go in that 8, maybe push 9, but I think they're going to be willing to offer him, give him that 5 years, $40 million deal, which is a fair contract for a guy like that. And if he's willing, it's going to come down to it. People will say, oh, he won't be able to put up stats anywhere else. But like you said, go get your money. It's a league like the NFL where contracts aren't guaranteed like the NBA or baseball. In a league with the NFL where, concussion and injury, anything like that can, stop your career from, you won't see another down in the NFL. Really, go get your money. He's a young guy. He's at 24. If he wants to come back eventually and go on, get on a winning team, come back to the Packers, whatever. I mean, you're not going to win in Oakland. It's just a fact. But at that point, really, you can come back at 28, 29 if he's still productive. He can come out and be a number 2, number 3, play in the slot still, and go ahead and win a championship, whatnot. But really, at this point, if you're talking in that 10 million plus range, it's just not a feasible number.
Absolutely. So looking forward, project. Let's say Randall Cobb hits free agency and he leaves. So Green Bay probably needs a wide receiver at least to draft one. But you're looking at free agency, your own free agents. You have $32 million cap space. Brian Bulaga, the 2 corners we mentioned, Devon House, Tramon Williams, B.J. Raji, LaTroy Guillaume. Which of those guys are you keeping with your $32 million?
I think at this point, Bulaga is a must. I hate saying that because he's hurt a lot, but when he is on, with him in the lineup last year, the Packers had one of the best 5 offensive lines in football. If you can give Aaron Rodgers that extra half second to throw the ball, that makes him even that much more dangerous. So, I mean, really at this point, I don't think I'd be willing to give him a high guarantee in terms of numbers, but I'd be willing to go in that 4-year, roughly $30 million total, $35 million total if you must. Really at that point, I think that's a fair deal. I think, given Ted Thompson's history of paying younger guys and letting the older guys walk, I think Devon House gets re-signed, like we said before, somewhere in that 4 years, in the $5 million a year range, maybe 4 for 20, 5 for 25. I think that's a good deal for for Devon House. LaTroy, he's gone. I don't think there's any chance that they re-sign him. If anything, really at that point, they kind of went back into, it's a similar case maybe to Johnny Jolly. And they gave that one more try and it didn't really work out all that well. So I'm not sure that they're going to be willing to go that route again. And finally, B.J. Raji, who knows, man? Really, if he can come on, really low contract, like I'm not paying him more than $1.5 million as a base deal, and you want to give him an incentive-laden contract, that could pay him in that $4 to $5 million range if he actually plays well and stays healthy, then that's fine with me. He didn't, he's been hurt, and it was said that he was finally in better shape, more committed to playing the game before he got getting hurt last year. But yeah, like I said, like I'll pay him, a very low amount of money and not significant, to hopefully at worst he becomes a rotational guy, and gives you a body to throw in there, 330 pounds, just But really at this point, I'm not really committed to throwing any money at either guy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you on Bulaga. I mean, he was one of the top right tackles in football this year, and if he hits the market, he's going to be the top offensive tackle in the market. So I think 4 years, $32 million, I could definitely live with that. If you have to go to 35 to keep him, I think you have to do that given how well the offensive line played last year. And you add a guy like Mike Soler, I think they can take another step forward in terms of run blocking. And this could be a top 5, maybe top 3 offensive line in football if everyone stays together, no big injuries. So I think you have to get that done. We agree on Devon House and the range for his money. Tramon Williams, just as mentioned before, the age. Looking at the nose tackles, I mean, LaTroy Guion, the off-field, the arrest in the offseason, they expect it will be cleared up or resolved in a few weeks. Maybe he's brought back, but I look towards Raji. In 2012, 2013, he was bad. And then they brought him back on the 1-year prove-it deal to move him to nose tackle in 2014. And just as everything was going well in the preseason, there were good reports about his health, about how he was playing in practice. He had the injury that cost him the season, torn bicep. So now he's going to have to take another prove-it deal. I'd give him a 1-year, $2 million deal. Just give him one more chance at that nose tackle where he looked more comfortable than playing on the end or at the 5. So I'd just give him that deal. And really, you're looking at $2 million for Raji, maybe $8 million for Bulaga, and another $5 million for Devon House. And you're still setting a pretty good situation with the numbers to look towards the outside free agents. While there's been a lot of talk about Terrence Knighton or Julius Thomas for for Denver, I think we can pretty much rule that out and look at smaller free agents. Is there anyone you have in mind at the smaller free agent area, mid-name guys who you think could help contribute that Ted Thompson could look after?
Really, I don't think there's like a ton of guys that there's a lot of. I mean, in the past when they've signed that veteran guy like Julius Peppers, and whatnot, I mean, they really haven't had a ton of guys inside of the building who needed to get paid. So I mean, if Cobb is to leave, I mean, you still have options inside of the organization. You mentioned Jeff Janis before. I don't think he's a slot guy. He probably is more outside. And I'm not going to be the one to say that he's the savior that a lot of people think he is just because he's a freak athlete and whatnot. And actually, caught a touchdown or two in the preseason last year. There's a reason he wasn't active for most of the games this year because he's a lot to learn. But I mean, going forward, so basically his year was a redshirt, and another redshirt year was Jared Abbrederis. I mean, a lot of people liked him last year. I mean, coming into the year, I think he ended up tearing his ACL or something like that. And one of the issues he had coming into the league was he was weak. I mean, he only did 4 reps of 225. So hopefully, I mean, over this past season, he was able to add a little bit of bulk. I still think he can be a productive slot receiver in the league. He's got that short area quickness. He runs well, runs solid routes, and has good hands. So I'm not willing to give up on him just yet either. So I mean, at receiver, I don't see us really spending any money in the open market. But if we're going to really add someone, it's going to be a slot receiver in the draft. So maybe in that 3rd, 4th round range. If you're looking at guys like Justin Hardy out of East Carolina, Tyler Lockett out of Kansas State, guys like that who are smaller guys, who aren't the most physically gifted guys in the world. But I mean, if you're looking back at a guy like Randall Cobb, who isn't the most physically gifted guy in the world, he just solid in all aspects of a slot receiver. Yeah,
I mean, looking at the guys that Ted Thompson's gone after, the veterans, more notable moves, they tend to be veterans who they were cut during the offseason by opposing teams, and Thompson just sees an opportunity to, take a chance on the guy just like a lottery ticket. If it doesn't work out, you can cut him easily, but some of them like Woodson, like Julius Peppers have worked out, so maybe that happens, but it's hard to find a name right now. One name that has been mentioned by Pro Football Talk was Percy Harvin if the New York Jets were to cut him. What are your thoughts on Percy Harvin as a possible fit for the Green Bay Packers?
I don't even want to address that. Like, it's so bad. Like, if you're going to assign a receiver to play the slot, it's going to be Randall Cobb and no one else. I think it's pretty simple in that regard because Percy Harvin, someone's going to pay him because he's still one of the most physically gifted players in the league. I mean, he's an idiot. He's a headache on and off the field, if you will. He's a migraine waiting to happen. But, like, in the grand scheme of things, I put that at next to 0% chance of actually happening. Just like any Julius Thomas talk, any of that. If they're going to add a Bronco, I'd like it to be Virgil Green as a quality, backup tight end who can block well. He's going to be pretty cheap. But I mean, other than that, I don't see them adding any type of big name free agent.
I was going to say, next to 0, that seems high, but then you named a player who I'd absolutely love Green Bay to land. Obviously, my eyes went big. Virgil Green, he was actually he was coming out of the draft. He's pretty considered a nice wide receiver, nice athletic gifts, but he had some issues blocking, and he developed into a very fine blocker. And if you look at that athletic gifts, as a number 2 tight end, I would love to add him.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be paying him a big amount of money. I think maybe if you're going to go that route, you might have to cut Andrew Corliss. I can live with that. He's making over $2 million next year, and I mean, as your number 3 tight end, I don't think you can pay a guy that kind of money. I mean, especially he just won't be playing enough snaps to justify paying them that kind of money. But adding a guy like Virgil Green, I mean, he's probably not going to catch a ton of passes for you, but he can be an improved blocker when you need it. Because at this point, Richard Rodgers isn't much of a blocker. He plays better out, split out in the slot. So I think at this point going forward that that could be an option for the Packers to upgrade that number 2 spot, particularly as a blocking tight end.
Absolutely. Now looking at Green Bay's needs, you mentioned draft earlier, guys like Justin Hardy. Green Bay, of course, holds the 30th pick in the draft. Have needs at nose tackle, cornerback, inside linebacker is a gaping need. Potentially offensive tackle or wide receiver, depending on what happens with their own free agents. And tight end, potential targets, Eric Kendricks from UCLA, Jordan Phillips we mentioned. Marcus Peters, it's unrealistic, but if Marcus Peters is there at 30, I will bang the table, I will bang the wall, whatever it takes, I want Marcus Peters to be in Green Bay, no matter how unrealistic it is. You also have Trey Waynes, Paul Dobson, who a lot of people love, but the terrible combine and 40 time especially, people have him falling down the boards dramatically. There's also Max Williams. Of those names, or are there any others that really jump out to you that you would love to have the 30th pick?
Really, personally, 3 guys that I'd love to see at 30. I mean, obviously, you addressed Marcus Peters, the cornerback out of Washington, who currently is the number 2 player on my board. He's got some off-the-field issues, but they seem to be, squashing them, him and that Washington coaching staff. But I still think there are rumors that he could be falling just because of, choking coaches and whatnot. That's not exactly the proper way to go about things. But, I mean, I'm going to do as much as I can to kind of push those rumors back in so that maybe he can fall to 30 to the Packers, and the Packers could get another steal like HaHa at 21 last year. Like we were talking about before, if Peters is on the board at 30 and the Packers don't take him, I might be looking for another team to root for. But no, another guy I'd love to see at 30 for the Packers, Eric Kendricks, one of my favorite players in this draft, a top 10 guy for me. He's a bit undersized. He's just over 6 foot, about 230, 235. But if you're looking for that guy who can cover, anybody coming out of the backfield, he can go out and cover tight end as well. And the instincts he has at the linebacker position are second to none. If you're looking for a comp, you're looking at a guy like Sean Lee for the Cowboys, but a Sean Lee who can stay healthy. I think that's a big difference. But I mean, eventually, who could be a top 5 middle linebacker in the NFL, despite his size. And finally, the ginger, Max Williams, tight end out of Minnesota. Special movement skills for a guy's size at 6'5", 250. He's a willing blocker. He's not a great blocker just yet, but he's willing. He has the ability to, add some extra weight, play closer to 260 in the NFL. But just a guy who can create yards after the catch. It shined in an offense who couldn't throw the ball last year. Really, I think him at 30 would be good value, and eventually I think he could be a guy who could replace Cobb even in the slot for the Packers.
And we mentioned a lot of guys we love. Peters, we talked about Kendricks. I mean, there's the instincts. There's a healthy Sean Lee. Those are 2 words together you will rarely hear. But really, if Kendricks can just continue to grow, he can be that. One other thing, I mean, Trey Waynes, I mean, if you're looking at cornerback help, maybe. Just Max Williams, who you talked a lot about. I like Richard Rodgers a lot, who's actually one of my favorite tight ends in last year's class. But he's not ever going to be a great tight end. Max Williams, maybe he can be a Jason Witten-like in a way. So those are some options. Of course, there's the names that we're not exactly a fan of. I mean, obviously, we kind of see the same a little bit on players. And as of recently, up until the NFL Combine when he had a bad 40 time, was Miami's Denzel Perryman to the Packers at the 30th pick. So why don't we talk about Denzel Perryman and his fit with the Packers and that stuff?
Denzel Perryman, like, coming in the NFL, if you're looking for almost like an identical A.J. Hawk replica, Denzel Perryman's your guy. Like, in the sense that he's going to be a 2-down linebacker. He played a lot heavier this year, roughly 250 to 252, somewhere in that range. Came back to the combine a lot lighter at 236. So you would have figured that he would have been able to get a little bit faster, run a better 40 time and whatnot, to just have a better combine overall. And he showed that even despite losing 15 pounds or so, that he's still a poor athlete for the position. He ended up running a 4.81 with a poor 10-yard split. I mean, really, at this point, he's probably an attacking downhill inside linebacker that's maybe late day 2, early day 3 value. But because of the name and his exposure and in the school that he goes to, people are talking about him as a late first-round value, and I just don't see that.
I mean, the name, the exposure. I mean, people have talked about him being a thumper who just delivers incredible hits. That's all fine and all. I'll take that type of guy in the late second, probably early mid-third round. And also, I've talked about it before, and this was before he blew up the combine, but if you're asking me to take Stephon Anthony from Clemson, or you're asking me to take Perryman from Miami at the end of the second round, I'm going to take Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, even guys like, I prefer USC linebacker Hayes Pollard. I think he's a better version of him. I think when you look at Perryman, I think people want him to be a guy who would be a good late second round pick. But in that sense, what you're looking for in him is just to be, a functional player in coverage and a good player in the run game. But in that case, what you end up getting is Stephon Anthony or Hayes Pollard, in my opinion. So those two are basically what people want Perryman to be. But even if you go back and look at Perryman's stats and look at him, towards the second half of the year, Miami pulled him off the field in nickel situations a lot. And if you can't do that in college, you certainly can't do it in the NFL. So really, I think he's an early day 3 guy for me. And I think it won't be too much longer before we stop seeing any mocks suggesting that Denzel Perryman's a first-round pick to the Packers.
Yeah, I think, fortunately, it's ending quickly. Now, one thing I did write about for Big Board Draft is a possibility, and it's something Ted Thompson is a fan of doing, is trading down. This draft, it's not super low. It's not anything close to last year's. I mean, there will be some reaches, especially you could see a team reach for a guy like Brett Hundley. Potentially, there's a situation where a team comes calling to Ted Thompson. Let's say they're at 37, 38, maybe the Rams a little bit later, offer their second round pick and a fourth. Do you think that's a situation where Ted Thompson says, you know what, I will happily trade down. I can get a guy that I still like?
Oh, definitely. I think given any opportunity to trade down at all, I think he'll do it. But I think that in the end, that's the problem. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of opportunity to do so. I think it's pretty much consensus at this point that there's a severe lack of first-round talent and top-end talent in this draft. Most people have roughly 15 to 20 guys. So beyond like the top 20 guys, like you're looking at it in the 20 to 60 range probably. You're getting a very similar value for the player. So I mean, there's some guys like a Brett Hundley. People are going to want to trade back in the first round for, at least it seems apparent. Todd Gurley out of Georgia, the running back, who, if not for health issues, who would probably be a top 15 pick. But I could see someone making a move for him, and similar to what the Patriots did for Dominic Easley last year. The guy who could have been a dominant player without the injuries. And just if there's a certain run on a position, maybe wide receiver, tackle, you could see that happening. If guys like Pete and who are probably more second round picks, or Eric Flowers, something like that to that range. If there's a run on them and people kind of want to get the last guy in that first tier of the position, but I just don't think that there's going to be a ton of interest from other teams to move up, like there might have been last year when you had quarterbacks like Manziel, Bridgewater, etc.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we've gone through draft talk. I mean, I think looking at that situation, we've named several guys who Green Bay could be interested in who would fit there. So, obviously, if the possibility is there, Ted Thompson will probably trade down. It is a situation of there's enough guys there that you don't have to pick at 30. You can move back. So, we've talked about the needs, and one thing I do want to include is, of course, the work you've done looking at a lot of Packers fits, looking at their Ted Thompson's draft history, the size of the players, and just what he looks for at certain positions. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I guess I've been kind of, for like the last 3 or 4 weeks now, looking at just going ahead and putting a database of all Ted Thompson picks, and then going ahead and just going and finding any the averages, the standard deviations and whatnot, doing some statistics behind it, which is so pathetic that I can't do them anymore. Just having to research it and trying to remember how to do any of this stuff. It's like junior year of high school, Nick would have been 100% okay with it, but I haven't taken a math class since high school. So, but no, I mean, I guess it's just trying to going ahead and trying to create a faux Packers board, if you will. And it's not really targeting players they will draft, but more eliminating players who just don't fit their mold. So if you're looking at let's say cornerback, the Packers have never drafted a defensive back who was under 5'11". So I think going forward, you can eliminate just about any player at that safety or cornerback position who isn't 5'11". So I mean, you're not going to be eliminating a ton of guys at that point, but if you can eliminate 10 to 15 at each position, in going forward, and so you're eliminating a guy like Ifo Ekpreolumu out of Oregon, or Steven Nelson out of Oregon State, guys who are good players and probably in that second to third round range, but guys who are 5'9", so the Packers aren't just going to consider them. Also, if it's really just, like I said, about eliminating players who the Packers just probably wouldn't consider because they just don't fit the mold of a player they like to fit at specific positions.
Absolutely, and I will say all your data and stuff you're looking at, Charles Barkley is very against what you're doing. He thinks it's just crazy talk. He thinks your use of stats is very wrong, but at the same time, he thinks you're using stats. So that kind of contradicts, but that's just Charles Barkley for you.
Well, yeah, he's not very intelligent, so let's move on from that.
All right, so before we wrap up, putting you on the clock, you are at 30. We will say Peters is gone. We'll say for Jordan Phelps is gone. Brett Hundley's gone, so you can't trade down. Who are you taking at that spot? Actually, no, just to mix it up, Eric Kendricks is gone too.
I knew you were going to do that, too. I probably shed some tears first. Pour one out for my homies who just got drafted. But if I have to just throw a name out there, shit. Is a guy, okay, specifically looking at defensive tackle, maybe a guy like Eddie Goldman still available out of Florida State. There's been a lot of talk about Stephon Anthony, the linebacker out of Clemson, and some ties so that he might be looked at as a first-round pick for the Packers. He fits every single mold, or every threshold. He's got the size, the athletic ability. I don't think he has first-round tape. I thought he was more of like a third-rounder in that sense. But there's been a lot of talk of him being tied to the Packers at 30. I hope not. I think a lot of it's going to come down to free agency. I mean, I think a guy at tackle, Jake Fisher out of Oregon, would be a very good fit at 30. He's not a powerful guy, but he's a mover. He's got great movement skills laterally and whatnot, things that Packers seem to look at, particularly if you're looking at tackle like David Bakhtiari. He probably ends up being a stronger version of him. But I guess if it comes down to like those guys being gone, I try to see if there's any way I can trade down, really. But I mean, like I said, it's going to come down to what they do in free agency. But if I have to just throw a name out there, I'll say Eddie Goldman out of Florida State.
I like it before, because obviously I want to thank you for coming on. I'm just saying, anyone who's watching, if you work with the Girl Scouts in any way and you want to send some lemon cookies to me or Nick, feel free. We will gladly accept them. And so please send them. We need food, so please.
All right.
And Nick, obviously, thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, you've been on several times. Love talking Packers, NFL draft, everything with you. So thank you so much, man.
That was fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, and that will wrap up a very good sports podcast. And by the way, just one final note. It was blue and black.
I'm not going to argue.